Today, the War Room finally presents to you, from beginning to end, the complete story of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. When World War II began in Europe in September 1939, it engulfed the continent's greatest powers in the conflict. The countries of the American continent found themselves caught in a delicate situation because many of them maintained strong commercial and political relations with the nations at war, including hosting several military missions from these nations. The consensus among most American countries was to individually issue declarations of neutrality during those weeks in September. Brazil was among the countries that responded this way to the new international crisis. The following year, however, the rapid and impressive German success in their summer offensive led to the collapse of France in just 6 weeks of fighting. It led to a complete redesign of the balance of power in the hemisphere, putting the German Navy in full operation in the Atlantic from French ports. Such a change alerted Washington to a possible increase in German influence in the American countries. And to launch a reaction to this possibility, the Havana Conference was held in July 1940, in which foreign ministers from across the continent issued a joint declaration stating that an attack on any American country would be considered an aggression against all of them. With the possibilities of trade with Germany becoming increasingly remote, the Brazilian president, Getulio Vargas, realized that at that moment only the United States could offer Brazil the commercial and financial opportunities the country needed. And he instructed his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Oswaldo Aranha, to seek closer ties with Washington. At the same time, the United States realized the high strategic value of Brazil for the war in the Atlantic, since the land extension represented by the Brazilian Northeast was the perfect base for launching anti-submarine missions along the equator, with the aim of protecting its maritime trade routes. Without Brazilian support, the United States Navy could not properly carry out such missions, since its continental bases were located too far from there. And, for that purpose, a considerable diplomatic effort was made to convince the Brazilian government to grant air and naval bases in the Northeast. A well-known opponent of the American presence in the Northeast was the Brazilian Minister of War, General Eurico Gaspar Dutra. At the same time, he faced the challenge of rearming and modernizing the Brazilian army to counter the regional threat represented at that time by Argentina, which was still the largest economic power in South America, and whose army had been trained by a German military mission. But in March 1941, with the creation of the Lend-Lease program in Washington, a vast financing initiative for the acquisition of war material by Allied foreign powers, Dutra saw an immense opportunity open up for Brazil. Negotiations with the United States accelerated from then on. In June, the United States Navy began operating out of the ports of Recife and Salvador, and the construction of vast air bases in Belém and Natal was also started, with the continuous arrival of thousands of American military personnel in these cities. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, drawing the United States definitively into the war the next day. This situation once again resonated throughout the continent, leading to the convening of the Rio de Janeiro Conference on January 15, 1942, at which several countries, with Brazil standing out, broke diplomatic relations with the Axis powers. This decision placed Brazil in a position of being a virtual ally of the United States, and Germany reacted by authorizing the sinking of ships flying the Brazilian flag, a fact that further fueled the escalation of Brazilian military actions to protect its navigation. On May 22, 1942, the Italian submarine Barbarigo, interestingly commanded by the Italo-Brazilian captain Enzo Grossi, was spotted off the coast of Ceará after attacking a Brazilian merchant ship, and shortly after it was found by a North American B-25 Mitchell bomber from the Brazilian Air Force, piloted by Captain Oswaldo Pamplona. Pamplona approached and bombed the submarine, which also opened fire with its anti-aircraft guns from the deck. but none of the attacks were fatal to the adversary. The Brazilian action, however, was publicly announced by the Minister of Aeronautics, Joaquim Salgado Filho, and it was interpreted by Germany as a declaration of war by Brazil. On the following day, May 23rd, the Brazilian government signed the Washington Agreements with the United States, in which the American government committed to finance $200 million through Lend-Lease, the purchase of modern war material for the Brazilian armed forces. The agreements also provided for the creation of two joint Brazil-United States military commissions, one in Washington and another in Rio de Janeiro, to regulate the new alliance between the two countries, while the Rio de Janeiro Commission had as its main objective to coordinate the activities of the American military mission for training the Brazilian armed forces. The one in Washington focused on joint military coordination for the defense of the Northeast. At that time, it had gained even greater importance, becoming the main air route to supply the British war effort in North Africa. While that commission was still being organized, on August 16th, the German submarine U-507, under Captain Lieutenant Herischart, approached the coast of Sergipe, entering the coastal navigation zone, sinking 5 Brazilian ships in 48 hours and causing the death of 600 people. This event sparked a wave of protests across the country, resulting in Brazil's declaration of war against Germany and Italy. On August 22, 1942, the declaration of war caught General Estevão Leitão de Carvalho, representative of the Brazilian Army, at the Washington Commission. In his final preparations for the first meeting of the body, which took place on September 3rd, the new scenario brought speed to the work, and the Commission approved 5 resolutions in its first meeting, most of them concerning the Brazilian Northeast. And by the end of 1942, 13 resolutions had been approved in Washington. The focus on the Northeast, however, began to lose importance after the American invasion of Morocco and Algeria. Operation Torch, carried out in November. This fact permanently removed the danger of a German action across the Atlantic against Brazil. From then on, the proposal to send a contingent of Brazilian troops to fight abroad began to be processed in the Ministry of War. And on January 6, 1943, Dutra presented Vargas with the proposal to create an expeditionary army with 4 infantry divisions and 1 armored division to be equipped with American materials. Getulio Vargas approved the document, and Dutra then submitted the idea to the Washington Commission, and Leitão de Carvalho began negotiations with the United States Army. However, the first half of 1943 saw a rapid advance of the Allied effort in North Africa, causing a consequent loss of priority for negotiations with Brazil, especially after the surrender of the Axis in Tunisia on May 13th. Realizing the delay, Dutra carried out his own process within the Ministry of War, getting ahead of Washington. And on August 9th, he issued Ordinance Number 4744, which created the organizational structure of the 1st Expeditionary Infantry Division. On that same day, he sent a confidential telegram to São Paulo addressed to the commander of the 2nd Military Region, General João Batista Mascarenhas de Moraes, saying, "I ask you, dear comrade, would you accept the command of one of the divisions that will make up the Expeditionary Corps? I need an urgent answer, because if you accept, you will undergo training in the United States." An experienced artillery officer, about to turn 60 years old, Mascarenhas was thrilled by the invitation and immediately gave his historic answer. "Very honored and with satisfaction, I respond affirmatively to the inquiry Your Excellency has just made to me." Right after that, Dutra took off for the United States to secure the approval of the resolution. And at the meeting on August 21st, the Joint Commission in Washington approved the creation of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force with 3 infantry divisions to operate abroad within the American chain of command. Despite his concern about the delay in negotiations with Washington, Dutra did not want to speed up the process of preparing the expeditionary units, assigning one of the infantry divisions already available in the Northeast to the task, because he didn't want to leave the region unprotected with such a strong American military presence there. In this way, he ordered the formation of the 1st Expeditionary Infantry Division, with units coming from 4 different military regions of the southeast and central west of Brazil. The infantry of the force was placed under the command of General Euclides Zenobio da Costa, a veteran of the 1932 Revolution, and its 3 selected regiments were the 1st Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Agnaldo Caiado de Castro, based in Rio de Janeiro, the 6th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel João de Segadas Viana, based in Caçapava, São Paulo, and the 11th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Delmiro de Andrade, based in São João del Rei, Minas Gerais. In addition, the 9th Engineering Battalion was brought from Aquidauana in the state of Mato Grosso, commanded by Colonel José Machado Lopes. The division's artillery would be composed of 4 groups of self-propelled howitzers, 3 with 105mm guns, and the last one with a 155mm caliber. The overall command was given to the former federal intervenor in Rio Grande do Sul and newly promoted General Osvaldo Cordeiro de Farias. The division would also have a small cavalry unit. The reconnaissance squadron, whose personnel were drawn from the 2nd Motorized Mechanized Regiment, based in Rio de Janeiro, as well as with the 1st Health Battalion, originating from medical units from Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo. In addition, the division was completed by a maintenance company, a communications company, a police platoon, and a band. Even though it was part of the American chain of command, the division was supposed to have its own support structure in Italy, with a personnel depot for replacements, a military justice section, a postal unit, and another from Banco do Brasil. And all these non-divisional units were placed under the command of General Olimpio Falconier da Cunha. The chief of staff of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was assigned to Colonel Floriano de Lima Brainer, the officer who was initially responsible for the organization and inspection of the units selected to join the division, realizing that some of them were in poor condition. In his first days of command, Mascarenhas focused on logistical problems, coordinating his divisional units scattered across a vast area of the national territory, and also on the arduous task of obtaining American war material for training, because virtually nothing that was used by the Brazilian army would be used on the battlefield. On October 18th, the Ministry of War handed Mascarenhas a regulatory document with instructions to align the divisional units with the new American standard, with the requirement that everything be ready within a month, a gigantic challenge for the commander. Since the end of World War I, the Brazilian army had been trained by the French military mission, whose teachings shaped the way the Brazilian army thought and organized itself. The fall of France in 1940 made the Ministry of War alarmed about the inadequacy of its own doctrines. And this was another factor that ended up bringing Brazil even closer to the United States. The American War School advocated a mechanized and highly technological war, requiring the use of specialized technical labor, such as tractor drivers, electricians, telegraph operators, and operators of complex machinery in general. These people did not exist in the ranks of the Brazilian army at the time, and reservists with technical specialties were recruited en masse. Quick technical training courses were also opened in Rio de Janeiro. In addition to organizational and material adjustments, another issue became the most problematic: the health requirements stipulated by Washington. The general physiological level of Brazilians in the 1940s was much lower than that observed in the United States, and when this parameter was applied to the troops, a large part of the contingent had to be dismissed, which created a new layer of complexity for recruitment. The contingent of the Expeditionary Infantry regiments had to be supplemented with soldiers from other regiments, as well as reservists from the shooting clubs, all selected for their outstanding physical health. The difficulties imposed by recruitment and by the long journey of the troops to Rio de Janeiro. It meant that until the end of 1943, the units of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force were still not concentrated in the federal capital. Mascarenhas left Zenobio in charge of continuing the organization, and on December 6th he left for North Africa and Italy to inspect the front line and make contact with the American command. He had his first meeting with General Mark Clark, commander of the 5th American Army, the unit to which his division would be attached. Only after Mascarenhas returned to Brazil in January 1944 did the Ministry of War order that all units be immediately dispatched to the military village in Rio de Janeiro. And this movement was only completed at the end of March. In the absence of the promised war material, which was never delivered by the Americans, Mascarenhas only handled the troops' physical preparation, relying on the support of a few examples of weapons demonstrated by Brazilian officers who had trained in the United States. On April 24th, the commander declared his troops ready and ordered the start of embarkation exercises. Since the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was supposed to embark for Europe on a large American transport ship, which, despite the agreements, still had no set arrival date, the Brazilian government was unaware. But in the first half of 1944, Allied logistical resources were in extremely high demand. Due to the upcoming major invasions of Normandy in Europe and the Marianas in the Pacific, both carried out in June of that year. On May 24th, the fully trained Brazilian Expeditionary Force held a parade through the streets of Rio de Janeiro, being warmly greeted by the population and by President Getúlio Vargas. And a few days later, Mascarenhas finally received the notice that the embarkation would take place in the following weeks. The circumstances, however, allowed at that moment the sending of only one transport ship, the United States ship General Mann, whose capacity allowed for only one of the 3 infantry regiments to be taken, along with 1/3 of the remaining units of the division. The ship's blueprints were sent in advance, and the general staff began to plan how the boarding order and accommodations would be arranged. And Mascarenhas selected the 6th Infantry Regiment to board in that first echelon. The entire boarding operation was carried out under the strictest secrecy, because there was fear that the German spy network would find out and inform Berlin, resulting in a possible submarine attack on the transport ship. To weaken Brazilian morale early in their involvement in the fight, on the night of June 28th, the gigantic General Mann entered Guanabara Bay and docked at the port pier, and on the following night, Mascarenhas ordered what the troops thought was just another embarkation exercise. Like so many others they had already done, the 3 fully equipped regiments were loaded onto trains bound for 3 different destinations in cars with blocked windows. But the train with the 6th Regiment was diverted from its planned destination and sent to the port of Rio de Janeiro, where the surprised soldiers found themselves facing the immense troop transport ship. The army had already blocked off the entire area to prevent the entry of onlookers and potential spies. But such a commotion could not go unnoticed. The boarding of the 5,075 men took place throughout the 30th, finally being completed that night. With the arrival of the command and the general staff, at the beginning of the early hours of July 1st, Getúlio Vargas arrived at the port, and he was taken by the Americans to the ship's command bridge, where he used the sound system to address the soldiers. Soldiers of the Expeditionary Force, the head of the government came to bring you a word of farewell in the name of the entire Brazilian nation. I know how much this transcendent moment costs all of us when you part from your homes, from the warmth and affection of your loved ones. Destiny has chosen you for the historic mission of making the green and yellow flag fly on the battlefields, to respond with Brazil's presence to the offenses and humiliations they tried to impose on us. With emotion, I leave you my wishes for complete success. This isn't farewell, but rather a see you soon, when you will hear the words of a grateful homeland. At dawn on July 2nd, the United States ship General Mann docked and began to move away from the pier, carrying General Mascarenhas and General Zenobio on board, in command of the 1st South American military contingent to set sail for combat in the Old World under their own flag. There began the epic journey of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. 1 week after leaving Rio de Janeiro, the troop transport ship United States ship General Mann, carrying the first echelon of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to Europe, was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The crossing of the equator was celebrated on board with the traditional Neptune ceremony. But the Brazilian troops had little reason to be cheerful. The vast majority of those 5,000 men had never been on a ship before. And the strict safety rules imposed by the United States Navy made the experience even less comfortable. General Mascarenhas, a passenger on that trip, remembered, "Unpleasant, truly unbearable, were the hot and endless nights spent in stuffy compartments packed to the ceiling, completely sealed so that not even the smallest part of the ship would be exposed. Besides that, the difference in food in the rough seas caused seasickness in a large number of the companions, which made life in the quarters intolerable." Mascarenhas knew they were headed to Italy, but didn't know the ship's final destination. Kept secret by American command, the United States ship General Mann passed Gibraltar into the Mediterranean. But only on the morning of July 16th did the Brazilians on board realize where they were. The imposing and threatening figure of Mount Vesuvius, the immense volcano that had erupted in fury just 4 months earlier, it was spewing a thin and continuous cloud of dark smoke to the right on the horizon, leaving no doubt. The ship was heading for the port of Naples. Mascarenhas was the first to disembark from the ship. In front of him was an honor committee from the United States Army, headed by General Jacob Devers, the American commander of the Mediterranean, who came to greet him upon his arrival. The troops disembarked from the ship and were sent to Bagnoli, a suburb of Naples, where they camped for the following weeks. Meanwhile, Mascarenhas and his staff were making arrangements to receive the promised equipment and weaponry, without which they could not proceed to the front line. In Brazil, on July 20, the Ministry of Aeronautics formed the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's most innovative unit, the 1st Liaison and Observation Squadron. Within the American war doctrine, divisional artillery was supposed to have an air contingent to guide the fire of its weapons, a practice that the Brazilian army was still unfamiliar with. The command of the squadron was given to Captain Aviator João Afonso Belloc, who had 2 months to select his aviators and ground personnel, as well as making contact with his observers, Army artillery officers, who would fly with their pilots. Afterward, Belloc reported to General Osvaldo Cordeiro de Farias, commander of the artillery of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, under whom his unit would serve in Italy. With the success of the Normandy invasion in northwest France, the Allied High Command decided to carry out a maneuver to split the German resistance in the country, landing also on the southern coast of France. This operation would be carried out with troops that, at that moment, were fighting in Italy, and the commander of the 5th American Army, General Mark Clark, was notified that he would have to give up the French Army Corps, composed of 3 divisions, for the invasion of southern France, with no expectation of receiving reinforcements. At that moment, the presence of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force on Italian soil became not only timely, but also essential for the 5th Army. On July 26th, the Brazilians moved to Tarquinia, where they finally received all their war equipment, including vehicles. From that point on, they began to move on their own. From then on, the Brazilian soldiers would be identified on the battlefield by the characteristic use of the American M1 steel helmet, as well as by various pieces of American clothing to complement the national uniform, especially the winter gear. Suddenly, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force started using the most advanced war equipment from American arsenals, with the notable exception of the infantry rifle. Even under the protests of Dutra and Mascarenhas, the Americans refused to deliver the semi-automatic rifle, one grant issued to Brazilian troops. Instead, they provided the outdated bolt-action Springfield M1903 rifle. On August 11th, Mascarenhas met Clark at his headquarters, where they decided to integrate the Brazilian Expeditionary Force into the 5th Army. within its four corps, commanded by General Willis Krittenberger, who, unlike Mark Clark, was not enthusiastic about receiving the Brazilian troops under his command. On the 18th, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force began moving to the Vada camp, where they would finally receive their final combat training. And there the troops celebrated the 7th of September with a parade for the Allied High Command in Italy. 2 days later, Mascarenhas and Krittenberger settled the details of the Brazilian troops' entry into the front line. At that time, with only one infantry regiment available in Italy, Brazil would enter combat as the Brazilian Expeditionary Force Detachment, a regimental scale unit that would operate as a reduced division and would be placed under the direct command of General Zenobio da Costa. While Mascarenhas was busy receiving and training the rest of the contingent, which was still coming from Rio de Janeiro, as was customary for inexperienced units. He was selected for the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's baptism of fire, a relatively calm sector of the front line, the coastal sector of the Tyrrhenian Sea, along the Serchio River, while the 1st Engineering Company had become the first Brazilian unit to enter service, carrying out repairs on the rear infrastructure. Since September 6th, it was on September 13th that the Brazilian Expeditionary Force Detachment received its first operational battle orders, having to move to Pisa that night. The next day, the troops marched to Vecchiano, 8 kilometers north of Pisa, to replace American soldiers on the front line. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force would finally be face-to-face with the enemy. On the other side of the front was the 14th German Panzer Corps. Under the command of General Friedhof von Schenger, the creator of the defensive system that had paralyzed the Allies throughout the first half of that year. In Monte Cassino, in that area, Schenger had at that moment a reduced infantry force, represented by the 42nd Jaeger Division, commanded by General Walter Jost. But he could count on vast artillery support, which included the powerful 280mm Krupp K5 railway gun. On September 16th, the still inexperienced Brazilian vanguards, who had the support of a company of American Sherman tanks, advanced north toward their first objective, the city of Massa Rosa, and by the end of that afternoon they took the town. After the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's artillery fired its first salvo at 2:22 post Meridian, the enemy evacuated Massa Rosa before the Brazilians arrived. This made Zenobio order the advance to continue up to Camaiore. However, already aware of the advance, the Germans met the Brazilian force with a heavy artillery barrage, which destroyed the bridge and blocked the advance of the tanks. That's when Captain Hernani Irosa da Silva, commander of the 2nd Company, decided to leave the tanks behind. And in the midst of the bombardment, he led an attack against the city, capturing Camaiore on September 18th. For this action, he was awarded the American Bronze Star. After this victory, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force Detachment now found itself facing the dreaded Gothic Line, the network of German defensive positions, which stretched from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic Sea over the Apennine mountain range. Meanwhile, in Brazil, General Cordeiro de Farias had been informed that 2 large transport ships were arriving in Rio de Janeiro to take the rest of the Expeditionary Division to Europe, and he would command the 2nd embarkation echelon, with the 3rd echelon under the command of General Falconier da Cunha. That's when the United States ship General Mann and the United States ship General Meigs docked simultaneously at the port pier. And at the military village, the 1st and 11th Infantry Regiments received orders to begin boarding. Unlike the boarding of the 1st echelon 2 months earlier, the 2nd boarding was done openly with wide press coverage. The soldiers boarded wearing uniforms specially designed for the crossing, and the 2 ships set sail from Rio de Janeiro on September 22nd. In Italy, Zenobio da Costa decided to begin the assault on the Gothic Line, an attack on Monte Prano, a hill used by the Germans as an observation post for their artillery, which overlooked Camaiore and the entire coastal plain. Once again, Captain Eirosa's 2nd Company led the attack, covered by the fire of the Sherman tanks. The attack began on the 21st, and the Brazilian troops advanced steadily as they drove out isolated groups. Resistance prisoners were interrogated, and they revealed that the command of the 42nd Jaeger Division intended to carry out a withdrawal on the 24th, abandoning their positions in the mountains. Thus, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force advanced in pursuit of the Germans, who were retreating, completely taking Monte and its surroundings on September the 26th. In the action, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force suffered its first combat casualties, with 5 killed and 17 wounded, capturing 31 prisoners and advancing 18 kilometers. In the following days, intelligence reports indicated a concentration of German forces in the Serchio River Valley, to the east of the Brazilian position. General Walter Yost had ordered the abandonment of the mountains southwest of the valley. In this way, the Brazilian command began a movement toward the valley, occupying Borgo a Mozzano. On the 29th, Zenobio moved the 1st and 3rd battalions to the valley, leaving Major Abilio Ponte's 2nd Battalion. Operating in the mountains to the west, Abilio pursued the Germans through the difficult terrain, finally making contact with the enemy in Fornovo Lasco on October 4th. Meanwhile, in the Serchio Valley, the Brazilian vanguard advanced, capturing several small towns along the riverbanks. But their advance was often delayed by enemy artillery, which enjoyed a wide field of vision from the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's position. Still, Major Silvino Castor da Nobrega's 3rd Battalion advanced and seized Fornet in a surprise attack on October 6th, capturing an ammunition and aircraft parts factory intact, a witness to the hurried withdrawal that had to be carried out by the Germans in the city. On that same day, the 2 transport ships docked in Naples, bringing the rest of the Brazilian division. General Mascarenhas went to receive his soldiers, finally relieved to have his entire contingent on Italian soil. The situation was completely different on the front line, however, which made the reception of these contingents quite different from what happened in July. The urgent need for troops on the battlefield meant that the men were quickly boarded onto infantry transport boats. On a 36-hour journey in the Tyrrhenian Sea heading north, the constant rocking of the boats caused even more severe nausea among the troops. The boats landed the soldiers in Livorno, and from there, they went to the camp in the San Rosori Woods, where the headquarters of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was located. Arriving on October 11th, there, the newly arrived contingents were welcomed by General Eurico Gaspar Dutra, who had been inspecting the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in Italy since late last month. Known for being extremely objective and a man of few words, Dutra met with the entire Allied command. From Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, commander of the 15th Army Group, to Mark Clark and Willis Krittenberger, to understand the framework of the Brazilian force and learn about its operations. After inspecting several contingents of the 5th Army and noticing that each division wore its own insignia on the left arm to identify the troop, Dutra asked Mascarenhas why the Brazilian Expeditionary Force didn't have a Mascarenhas. He told him that he had thought about the matter and that one idea presented to him was to use a smoking snake. As a clear response to the provocations received in Brazil, it was once said a snake would smoke before the Brazilian Expeditionary Force went to war. Besides attending official receptions, Dutra chose to visit the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's front line in the Serchio Valley to see the war up close with his own eyes. Ignoring the concerns raised by Mark Clark about his safety, Dutra advanced to the observation posts closest to no man's land, praising the performance of the Brazilian force up to that point. Returning to Brazil on October 18th after the conquest of Forna, Krittenberger ordered a pause in the attacks to consolidate his positions, and only Brazilian patrols began to probe the front line, noting that Barga had already been evacuated by the Germans. The city was occupied by the Brazilian Expeditionary Force on October 11th, along with Gallicano. On the 13th, the intelligence of the 5th Army reported a concentration of enemy troops in the defensive positions of the city of Castelnuovo di Garfagnana, the region's main logistical junction. including elements of the 232nd Infantry Division of General Eckhard Freiherr von Gablenz. At this point, the Allied command faced a major dilemma. It would become obvious that the Germans were heavily reinforcing Castelo de Garfagnina, and that capturing the town should be done as soon as possible, before the reinforcements could consolidate. However, the small number of Brazilian troops available, who by that point were already exhausted from an entire month of relentless combat, imposed a dangerous limitation on the Allied offensive power. Since the rest of the Brazilian division was still receiving their weapons in the rear, even so, Brazilian patrols scoured the entire front line, establishing increasingly advanced positions on the ground, occupying Somocolonia. On October 24th, the command also received information that the Italian Alpine Division Monte had arrived to reinforce Castelo de Garfagnina under Krittenberger's orders. Zenobio attacked on the rainy morning of October 30th, with Major Juan Carlos Gross's 1st Battalion coming out of Somocolonia towards Lama de Soto, capturing the location at 11:45 in the morning. Throughout the entire day, the Brazilian infantry took from the enemy all the starting points for the final attack on Castelo de Garfagnina, concluding the movement at 6:30 in the evening, bringing the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to just 4 kilometers from the city. The rapid success of the troops in that day's attack raised Zenobio's confidence in a victorious capture of the enemy fortress. But the soldiers' exhaustion and the fragility of the front line positions would bring a terrible surprise to the Allied command. In German military doctrine, the loss of an important position to the enemy should be followed by an immediate counterattack, and the Brazilian Expeditionary Force would learn this fact the hard way. In the cold and rainy early morning of October 31st, Germans and Italians launched a counterattack against the positions of the 3rd Company, which suddenly found itself under fire from the front and from the sides. Retreating to Albiano in the morning, another counterattack came, this time with heavy artillery support. The 1st Company held out until they ran out of ammunition, but had to retreat to Catanina, resulting in the loss of the positions gained the previous day. The counterattack alarmed General Mark Clark, who urged the deployment of the rest of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to the front line immediately. Even without completing their training period in the rear, despite the setback on the 31st, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force's performance over the previous 45 days impressed the American command, leading Clark to give the Brazilian division a bigger challenge. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force would move to the central sector of the Fifth Army's front, where the Germans had set up a defense that was, until then, impregnable on the Gothic line, whose fall was essential for victory in Italy. The Brazilian troops would be transferred to the Reno River Valley, setting up positions in front of Monte Castelo, beginning a new and complex phase in the combat operations of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. In the first days of November 1944, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was moving along the Allied battlefront in northern Italy. It was leaving the secondary sector of the Serchio River Valley after 45 days of successful combat, and now it was heading toward the most intense operational zone of the Fifth Army, the Reno River Valley. The geography of Italy posed a serious defensive challenge to the Germans, who were now entrenched along the Gothic line. The network of fortifications that ran above the Apennine Range, a long chain of mountains that cuts across the entire Italian territory from northwest to southeast. However, just north of the Apennines lies the Po River Valley, a vast plain that offered no defensive conditions, and General Heinrich von Fittenhof, commander of the German forces in Italy, knew that the loss of the defensive positions on the Gothic line would mean the end of German resistance in the country. In this way, the German High Command clung to their fortifications in the mountains, and dislodging them from there would be the tough task for the Allied armies. On the other side of the front line, General Mark Clark, commander of the United States Fifth Army, faced the task of overcoming the Gothic line and reaching the city of Bologna, the key to accessing the Po Valley, And to do that, he would have to capture Highway 64, which runs along the Reno River at the bottom of the valley all the way to Bologna. However, the powerful German artillery was able to target the entire road, guided by observers positioned above the mountain peaks to the north, thus preventing any American progress toward Bologna. In order for Bologna to be captured, it was first necessary to drive the Germans from the sides of the highway by capturing the entire mountain range. And one of those mountains was the famous Monte Castelo. Monte Castelo was the most heavily armed and advanced formation of the Belvedere della Torraccia mountain range, giving the Germans a full view of Highway 64. The German observers above Monte Castelo directed artillery fire from the guns mounted on the mountains behind them, and the capture of this position was declared a high-priority objective by the Allied command, which entrusted the mission to the Brazilian Infantry Division. The Brazilian troops completed their movement on November 9th, having replaced the soldiers, the Americans, at all points of their new and long front line, which stretched from the vicinity of Gaudio Montano to the outskirts of Torre di Nerone, over a distance of 15 kilometers. The commander of the 4th Army Corps, General Willis Krittenberger, was determined to eliminate the German presence in the mountains before the arrival of winter, and he immediately ordered Mascarenhas to launch an attack against Monte Castelo, which was defended by the 12th and 32nd Infantry Divisions under General Eckhard Freiherr von Gablanz. However, Mascarenhas had only a third of his troops at that moment. On the front line, the now weary 6th Infantry Regiment, which had been in continuous combat for almost 2 months. His other 2 regiments were still in the rear, receiving weapons, and their training was not supposed to be completed before the first week of December. General Brasileiro explained to the American command the impossibility of launching an offensive while guarding 15 kilometers of front line with so few soldiers. But Mark Clark's response to the problem was categorical. The rest of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force should then be brought immediately to the front line, even with incomplete training. Dismayed, Mascarenhas ordered the 1st and 11th Regiments to move from their camp in San Rossori to Borgo Capani, 3 kilometers south of his advanced headquarters in Porretta Terme. The troops began arriving at Borgo Capani on November 19th, and 2 days later, the 1st Battalion of the 1st Infantry Regiment had already become a reserve element of the 4th Army Corps. Moving the 10,000 men would still take several days, but General Krittenberger was eager to launch the attack, and he ordered the action to be carried out by an American contingent called Task Force 45, which would have Brazilian support only as Major Silvino's battalion, the Reconnaissance Squadron, and the 9th Engineering Battalion. Task Force 45 was placed under the command of the American General Paul Rutledge, and with the support of the armored vehicles and artillery of the 4th Corps, it launched a frontal attack on Monte Castelo and Batalha on November the 24th, resulting in complete failure. The attack was spotted in advance by the Germans, and their artillery launched a devastating barrage against Rutledge's advance, preventing any gain of ground. Determined, the general decided to try a new attack the next day, this time setting up 2 fronts to disperse the concentration of the enemy artillery. In addition to attacking Monte Castelo, Task Force 45 also attacked Monte Belvedere at the western end of the mountain range, and with their artillery divided, the Germans were unable to withstand the attack. The summits of Monte Castelo and Monte Belvedere were occupied by the Americans and Brazilians, causing a wave of enthusiasm among the Allied generals. But that feeling of joy would be short-lived. By dividing the troops into 2 fronts, Rutledge dangerously reduced his strength, and, as usual, the Germans responded to the loss of the important Monte Castelo with an immediate counterattack that retook the hill on the same day. Faced with failure, Krittenberger returned command of the Brazilian units of Task Force 45 to Mascarenhas. On the following day, on that 26th of November, the Brazilian commander had for the first time on the front line control of his entire division. At the same time, Krittenberger urged Mascarenhas to attack Monte Castelo within 3 days, a dangerously short deadline. While the exhausted 6th Regiment was at that moment being replaced on the front line, Mascarenhas would have to use inexperienced troops for the attack on the mountain, increasing the risks of the entire operation. The defensive position set up by goblins on Monte Castelo had been reinforced after the scare on the 25th, and now had more soldiers. Vast minefields covering the approach routes, a long series of bunkers and machine gun nests staggered in depth, as well as several snipers positioned throughout the terrain. All of this was complemented by the heavy-caliber German artillery, whose precise fire was called upon whenever necessary. Misfortune still struck on the night of November 28th, the eve of the attack. The Germans attacked and drove the Americans from the top of Mount Belvedere, retaking the entire mountain in the following hours. In possession of that position, the German command now had its entire force free to act as needed. At 4 in the morning on November 29th, the Brazilian attack force began moving to their starting points for the offensive, which would begin at 6 in the morning. The rain that had fallen the previous night had left the ground muddy, causing a 1-hour delay to the attack, which was finally launched at 7 in the morning with an artillery barrage by Cordeiro de Farias. In the attack were the first-timers, the 1st Battalion of the 1st Regiment, commanded by Major Olívio Uzeda, and the 3rd Battalion of the 11th Regiment, commanded by Major Candido da Silva, whose soldiers would have their first contact with war precisely against the fortress of Monte Castelo. The Brazilian advance came at a high cost that morning, with both battalions managing to make progress until noon, at which point they were halted on the ground by German weapons. The casualties steadily increased from that point on, and shortly after a counterattack forced the Uzeda battalion back. Candido, now isolated, withdrew with his battalion. And, with night approaching, within a few hours, the order to abandon the attack was given by the Brazilian command. The cost of rushed planning and the use of inexperienced troops was high, and between dead and wounded, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force counted 190 casualties. Even so, Mark Clark remained insistent on capturing Monte Castelo before winter, and he ordered Mascarenhas to make one more attempt, this time ensuring greater artillery support from the 4th Corps for the Brazilian attack. At the beginning of December, the weather started to deteriorate, and the attack was postponed to the 12th, in the hope that the heavy clouds would dissipate over the area. The use of the rookie contingents would once again be necessary, and an event that occurred at the beginning of that month had shown the risks of this situation. On the night of December 2nd to 3rd, the 1st Battalion of the 11th Infantry Regiment, which had just arrived from the rear, was sent to man the front line at Guanella, facing Monte Castelo. That night, the inexperienced soldiers and officers were surprised by a reinforced patrol of about 40 German soldiers, with support from machine guns and mortars. And when they suddenly came under fire, they panicked. Some soldiers abandoned their positions, and afterwards the officers themselves ordered a retreat, leaving all their equipment behind. During what became known as the Night of the Lorindos, despite the scare they caused, the Germans didn't have enough troops to occupy the Brazilian positions. And quickly, Mascarenhas ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 6th Regiment to occupy the abandoned sector of the front line. December 12th dawned completely overcast with low clouds and a fine persistent rain. Clouds covered Monte Castelo's summit, and with that, Mascarenhas hoped to be able to maintain the element of surprise in the attack until the last moment. But those extreme weather conditions, which allowed a maximum visibility of 50 meters, also made it impossible to adjust the artillery fire, as well as the use of aviation in support. But even the element of surprise that Mascarenhas intended to use to his advantage was completely dismantled. At 6 o'clock in the morning, at the exact moment when the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 1st Regiment silently set out for the attack, the American artillery opened a massive barrage of fire on Mount Belvedere, alerting the Germans that something was about to happen. After detecting the direction of the Brazilian attack, Goblins reacted. He unleashed his full arsenal, paralyzing the 2nd Battalion just meters from their starting point. This made General Zenobio send his operational reserve, the 3rd Battalion of the 11th Regiment, in support. After receiving support, the troops began to advance slowly, but some platoons found themselves completely paralyzed by machine gun fire and clung to the ground. The chaos caused by the violent German reaction and the constant bad weather during the attack led to numerous casualties, including some from friendly fire coming from the American tanks. On the right flank of the attack, the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Regiment, commanded by Major Franklin Rodriguez, managed to advance up the hill, even under intense fire. And, in the early hours of that afternoon, their vanguards entered the foggy zone that covered the top of the hill. In a display of determination and courage in the face of a grim scenario, Brazilian soldiers managed to reach the summit of Monte Castelo, but ended up being killed by the Germans inside the cloud, and their bodies remained there unburied throughout the entire winter. At 3 o'clock, with nightfall already approaching, the Brazilian command gave orders to abandon the attack, withdrawing their battered troops from the mountain. Faced with the disaster of that day, Krittenberger decided to order the suspension of all offensive activities of the 4th Corps for the rest of the year, putting the entire front line on the defensive. Monte Castelo stood firm before Mascarenhas's eyes, de Moraes as a formidable enemy that would require from him a supreme improvement to be conquered. The Brazilian soldiers would have to become professionals, and the approaching winter would be the opportunity for that to happen. Quickly, the temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero, and the snow covered the entire landscape of the Apennines. Faced with such a novelty for the Brazilian troops, who were used to tropical heat, the soldiers dressed in white coverings for snow camouflage, provided by the Americans in improvised ways to keep themselves dry and warm in those harsh conditions. At the same time, having privileged views of the Brazilian positions below the command, the German command constantly bombarded the front line posts with their heavy artillery, and especially Mascarenhas's headquarters in Porreta Terme. But it was during that winter that the entire Brazilian Expeditionary Force gained valuable combat experience, carrying out constant patrols of the front line. In these actions, a Brazilian combat group would cross no man's land and probe the enemy front line, conducting reconnaissance and capturing prisoners several times, engaging in combat with German patrols and fortified positions. The months of December and January were transformative for the Brazilian Expeditionary Infantry Division, which emerged from them as a fully integrated and experienced combat force, totally unlike the prior year's Brazilian Expeditionary Force. And it was during that winter that the Brazilian soldiers began to wear on their left arm the insignia that would make them known worldwide. The green snake smoking a pipe against a yellow background, topped by the word Brazil. Still at the end of December, a major change in the Allied command took place, with Mark Clark taking command of the 15th Army Group. With the 5th Army being handed over to General Lucien Trescott, Trescott reassessed the 5th Army's battle plans and shifted the offensive axis to the 4th Corps sector, planning to reach the Po Valley through the Panero River Valley, which is less steep than the Reno Valley up to Bologna. The Monte Castelo mountain range now had to be captured not only to open Highway 64, but also because it was directly in the path of the Allied advance. To eliminate the artillery support for Monte Castelo, Krittenberger would now rely on the 10th Mountain Division, an elite Alpine unit newly arrived from the United States. The offensive, now named Operation Encore, would be launched by the 10th Mountain Division. They were supposed to take Monte Belvedere and Monte Gorgolesco, eliminating the entire German western flank. This would allow the Brazilian Expeditionary Force to attack Monte Castelo while advancing in the rear to take Monte della Torraccia. The American attack began on February 19th with the 10th Mountain Division surprising the Germans. At the top of Monte Belvedere, taking that elevation, and Monte Gorgolesco on the same day, forcing the enemy to retreat to the east. On the 20th, the Thunderbolts of the 1st Brazilian Fighter Group attacked the German positions at Monte Castelo, destroying bunkers and other fortifications throughout the area. And at the sunny dawn of February 21st, the Brazilian command finally felt confident in the mission. The main attack of the 1st Regiment progressed as planned, covered by a vast bombardment from the divisional artillery, which was directed by the aerial observers of Captain Balocchi's squadron. The 2nd Battalion of the 11th Regiment, in a secondary attack, took and occupied Bethea, taking control of the mountain pass away from the Germans. 3 Brazilian battalions climbed the hill, overwhelming the German defenses, which resisted as best they could against coordinated Brazilian fire. Unlike previous attempts, the overcoming of the last third of the elevation was done with strength and speed. And at 5:20 p.m., the German resistance collapsed. The Brazilian soldiers victoriously occupied the summit of Monte Castelo, this time permanently, finally eliminating the enemy stronghold that had challenged them since the previous year. Mascarenhas had at that moment a large delegation at his command post, which had come to closely follow the Brazilian attack. Upon securing the victory, he was warmly congratulated by Mark Clark and Willis Kreitenberger, putting to rest any doubts about the fighting value of his division. The fighting to conquer the mountain range would continue in the following days. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force was now reinvigorated, confident, and aware of its worth. The Brazilian division was now ready to achieve the final victory against the German army. The day after its victory over the German stronghold of Monte Castelo, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was finally complete on Italian soil. The Expeditionary Infantry Division had completed its landing in September 1944, but the Brazilian Expeditionary Force still included a personnel depot of 10,000 men as a reserve. 2 transport echelons, each with 5,000 soldiers, had left Rio de Janeiro in November 1944 and February 1945, and the 5th and last echelon of the force landed in Naples on February 22nd, being transported to the depot camp in Stafoli. From there, thousands of soldiers would leave, sent to the front line to replace the dead, wounded, sick, and missing of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force. And after the costly battles of that winter, the ranks of the Brazilian division had many new faces. At the front lines, the victory over Monte Castelo on February 21st did not mean a celebration of victory, since the fighting continued right after the mountain was taken. A second set of mountains to the northeast, dominated by the German observation point at Monte Sopracazzo, also had to be taken to clear the way north. And this task was assigned by the American command to General Mascarenhas de Moraes. Besides Sopracazzo, that group had a dangerous enemy position known as Torre de Neron, which for months harassed the right flank of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, as well as a German fortress in the village of Castelnuovo, which controlled the route that circled the mountains. On February 23, Mascarenhas ordered the attack to start, and that night, the 6th Company of the 2nd Battalion of the Sampaio Regiment advanced to take La Serra, a German forward position. At the foot of Sopracazzo, one of the platoons of the 6th Company, commanded by 1st Lieutenant Apolo Miguel Resch, became the spearhead of the Brazilian advance. And it was approaching La Serra when it was detected by the enemy. In a short time, Lieutenant Apollo's platoon found itself surrounded from the front and sides by 6 German machine guns. They were between 15 and 80 meters away, forcing the Brazilians to take cover. Even under a clear disadvantage in firepower, Apollo decided to hold his position, coordinating the Brazilian response. Even after being wounded and refusing to be evacuated, he continued to fire at the Germans throughout the night, eventually overcoming them and capturing La Serra. For his actions, Lieutenant Apollo was decorated by the American command with its second highest honor for bravery, the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, making Apollo the most decorated Brazilian combatant of World War II. In the following days, the position of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force was split in two, flanking the advance of the 10th Mountain Division from the left and right. In this way, on the eastern sector, the 6th Infantry Regiment, now under the command of Colonel Nelson de Mello, occupied Monte de la Crote on March 4th, starting an advance eastward along the mountain ridge, covered by divisional artillery fire. The next day, under heavy enemy fire, Brazilians captured Monte Soprachazo, and, showing great operational maturity, they resolutely repelled the German counterattacks that tried to retake the position. Lieutenant Hugo Correa, who had been brought from the personnel depot to the front line and had received command just a few days ago of a 6th Regiment platoon, described the attack. In this way, these men from the Brazilian countryside, with their unmilitary and healthy appearance, but resilient and courageous, managed to achieve the feat of advancing in such a well-executed and synchronized progression up that steep slope, covering a distance of 500 meters in just a few minutes. Synchronized with our artillery barrage, they drove the enemies out of their bunkers, dug into the hillside, surprising them, and using automatic weapons and rifles, firing into those shelters as if hunting wild animals. From them came the once unbeatable soldiers, now cowardly, begging us not to kill them. While the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 11th Regiment set out to flank the German position in the mountains, the 6th Regiment advanced against Castelnovo, and despite the intense reaction from enemy artillery, they managed to reach the city at 7 o'clock that night, completing the expulsion of the Germans the following morning. After taking control of the mountain roads, the 4th Corps consolidated its new front line, and General Kreitenberger suspended offensive activities on March 7th. The 10th Mountain Division was exhausted and needed rest, as did the Brazilian Infantry Division. Mascarenhas took advantage of the stabilization phase to provide his soldiers with a well-deserved rest, since they had been in uninterrupted contact with the enemy since the previous autumn. Therefore, the division command organized a leave system for the men. They were sent on leisure trips to Rome and Florence, where they could go to movie theaters, bars, and dances. Thus, the rest of March went by, while the winter finally gave way to the spring of 1945. On March 20th, Mascarenhas was summoned to a meeting with the commanders of the 4th Corps at Kreitenberger's headquarters, and he presented him with the plans for the final attack against the Germans in Italy, designated Operation Grapeshot, but which would become popularly known as the Spring Offensive. The general plan of the offensive assigned the 4th Corps the task of overcoming the last German strongholds on the way to the Pinaro River Valley and to occupy its eastern bank, following it to capture Vignola, the key to entering the Po River Valley plain. The direct offensive movement would be carried out by the 10th Mountain Division and the 1st Armored Division, with the Brazilian Expeditionary Force advancing north to secure the flank of the main attack. However, Mascarenhas requested an extension to the east of the Brazilian zone of operations, thus relieving the burden on the 10th Mountain Division. Kreitenberger agreed with the Brazilian general. The Brazilian Expeditionary Forces front expanded to include Monte, the last major German stronghold in those mountains, defended by the 114th Jaeger Division, commanded by General Hans-Joachim Hellert. Monte was located on the western face of the last mountain, just before the Pinaro River, and at its top there was a medieval tower, used by the Germans as an artillery observation post. The movement of the 4th Corps for the attack began on April 7th, with all preparations completed by the 13th. Meanwhile, several patrols were sent out against the front line to probe the enemy's positions on the ground. To lead the attack, General Mascarenhas chose the 11th Regiment of Colonel Delmiro de Andrade, the last of his 3 regiments that had entered the line the previous year, and the only one up to that point that had not taken the lead in an offensive. The direct offensive against the city of Monte would fall to the 1st Battalion of the 11th Regiment commanded by Major Manuel Lisboa. Meanwhile, Major Candido da Silva's 3rd Battalion would attack the elevation on the right, aiming to capture the summit at Montello. The 2nd Battalion of the 1st Regiment, under the command of Major Chiseno Sarmento, would carry out a secondary attack to protect the right flank of the 11th Regiment. On the morning of April 14th, the day the spring offensive began, the Brazilian attack started at 10:15, in sync with the attack of the 10th Mountain Division. A dense barrage of Brazilian artillery preceded the infantry's advance, pounding all the enemy strongpoints located by the patrols. In the previous days, the Ceseno Battalion was the first to advance in its secondary attack. But as soon as the cloud of dust from the Brazilian barrage cleared, the German observers on top of Monte spotted the advancing platoons, ordering the most terrible artillery barrage that the Brazilian Expeditionary Force faced in World War II. General Ehlert knew perfectly well the risks that losing his position in Monte would mean, and he managed to concentrate almost all of the German howitzers in the sector to protect the city. At 1 p.m., the attack by the 11th Regiment was finally launched. General Cordero de Farias launched another powerful barrage from his artillery against the city of Monte, aiming to blind the Germans to the Brazilian advance. At 3 p.m., the first Brazilians entered the city. At the front of the advance was the 2nd Company, with 3 platoons arranged side by side. In the center was Lieutenant Ipora Nunes de Oliveira's platoon, with Sergeant Nestor da Silva as his deputy commander. Upon reaching the first blocks of Monte, the platoon requested by radio for the Brazilian artillery to cease fire, as the shells were falling in front of them. When the shelling was stopped, the platoon began their advance up the streets, but the soldiers quickly hit the ground, as the sound of a precise enemy artillery salvo struck them from all sides, cutting the unit's telephone communication cable and completely isolating them. Multiple soldiers were injured, and Sergeant Nestor was hit by a grenade fragment in the back of his head, tearing his helmet, and by mere millimeters not hitting the back of his neck. To the right of Iporán, Lieutenant Ari Houwen's platoon advanced through the southeastern region of Monte, when they were also halted by heavy artillery fire, to which several German machine gun nests joined in. The soldiers took cover, and Houwen went ahead to do some reconnaissance from the enemy resistance points when he was suddenly hit in the head by an enemy projectile, dying shortly after. Without any communication with the rest of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, Iporán led a fearless attack up the city, putting Brazilian soldiers at the front for the first time. In an urban combat situation, clearing house by house the center of Monte of enemy presence. At the end of that afternoon, Iporá himself reached the city tower, climbing its stairs and reaching the top of the building, which had just moments before been evacuated by the Germans. Communication with Iporá's platoon was only restored at nightfall, and the lieutenant discovered that he was still virtually isolated in the city, since the Germans had resisted the advance of the 3rd Battalion on the eastern hills, and the platoon on his right remained pinned down by enemy fire, without leadership and suffering heavy casualties. Faced with the grim situation, General Mascarenhas picked up the phone and called the Iporá platoon, which was sheltered from enemy fire in a church. Resorting to a very rare measure in the history of the Brazilian army, Mascarenhas called Sergeant Iporán, Sergeant Nestor, on the phone and said to him, "Sergeant Nestor, I have just signed your promotion from 2nd Sergeant to 2nd Lieutenant. Honor these stars just as you honored your sergeant's stripes. Take immediate command of the platoon to your right and move forward. Good luck." On the morning of the following day, Brazilian artillery resumed fire on Montello and the mountain peaks, allowing Major Candido's attack to resume. Officer candidate Francisco Mega, who was leading his platoon in the attack on those positions, was hit in the chest by a burst of machine gun fire. He ordered the advance to continue before passing away. In the city, the Brazilian platoons, now reinforced, continued the house-to-house fighting, also advancing slowly throughout the whole day. The German resistance in Monte was only overcome on the 16th, and in the following 48 hours, the Brazilian soldiers cleared the entire area ahead towards the Panaro. As expected, the German resistance in that sector of the Apennines collapsed after the loss of Monte. On April 19th, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force reached the valley and occupied its eastern bank while moving north. On April 21st, after being delayed by numerous minefields and traps left by the enemy, the Brazilian vanguards occupied Zoca. By the end of the next day, they arrived in Vinhola at the Apennines base, bringing the Brazilian Expeditionary Force into the Po Valley. From there, the objective of the Allied High Command was to pursue at maximum speed the fleeing German divisions across the plain before they could reach the Alps and escape to Germany. Krutenberger's orders to Mascarenhas excluded the Brazilian Expeditionary Force from the northward pursuit, assigning the Brazilian division elsewhere. The task of covering the flank of the American advance heading northwest along the road to Milan. Furthermore, to speed up its mobility, the 4th Corps had requisitioned the trucks from the Brazilian Expeditionary Force infantry, leaving the division dangerously behind. But intelligence reports indicated the presence of enemy formations still trapped in the coastal region of La Spezia. Mascarenhas decided to block their escape. General Cordero de Farias provided the artillery trucks for transporting the infantry, and the Brazilian Expeditionary Force set out in pursuit. The M8 Greyhound armored vehicles from the reconnaissance squadron, commanded by Captain Plinio Pitaluga, went ahead, scouting the terrain kilometers ahead of the troop trucks. Reaching São Paulo Denza on April 24th and continuing quickly northwest, Pitaluga entered Colecchio shortly after noon on April 26th, where his armored vehicles made contact with an enemy vanguard. Receiving the Germans' location from the squadron, Mascarenhas ordered the immediate transport of the infantry to Colecchio, where they arrived that night, decisively blocking the enemy's escape route to the north. The German troops consisted of the 148th Infantry Division, commanded by General Otto Fraterpico, along with the remnants of 2 other divisions that had retreated from the coastal sector. And they were trying to escape to Germany. At that moment, they were trying to reach the supply depots maintained in Colecchio. Soldiers from the 6th Infantry Regiment captured the depots and pushed the Germans to the south, advancing as far as Gaiano on the 28th, where they were blocked by a line of enemy machine guns. Mascarenhas then ordered the encirclement of the German troops already in Fornovo di Taro. After a Brazilian ultimatum, emissaries were sent by General Fraterpico to negotiate the surrender of his troops, which was agreed to take place the following day. Thus, in the early afternoon of April 29th, the first German units began to surrender to the Expeditionary Force. In an endless line that continued through the night, the surrender was only completed on the 30th, when the Brazilian Expeditionary Force counted the surrender of 15,000 enemy soldiers. General Fraterpico was the last to surrender. That afternoon, General Falconier de Cunha escorted him to the rear to surrender. At the same time, the Axis High Command in Italy was signing the surrender agreements of its armies. And, in this final phase of the campaign, motorized patrols of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force spread throughout northwestern Italy, reaching Milan and Turin, and finally reaching the French border. The Axis forces in Italy laid down their arms on May 2, 1945, bringing the fighting in that theater of operations to an end once and for all. A week later, Germany would sign its final surrender, bringing an end to World War II in Europe. The Brazilian division celebrated its victory with the pride of a job well done, and with the certainty that they would see their homeland again, so far from that now devastated continent. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force started occupation duties in the area, and in those days, Brazilian soldiers were able to visit several tourist cities in northern Italy and France. On May 4th, General Lucien Truscott hosted a commemorative lunch for the unit commanders of the Fifth Army. Upon arrival, Mascarenhas was applauded and congratulated for Brazil's success in capturing the enemy division. On May 7th, the Brazilian commander met with General Mark Clark, who told him, For me, it was a privilege to be associated with the Brazilians in the campaign. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force completed all assigned missions, precisely, relentlessly pursued the enemy, and forced an entire division to surrender. It was a magnificent end to a magnificent performance. Concluding its period of occupation at the beginning of June, the Brazilian division began to be transported back to Brazil. And the first group, made up of 5,000 soldiers, set sail from Naples on July 6th, arriving in Rio de Janeiro on July 18th, where the soldiers were warmly welcomed by the population. They held a triumphant parade through the streets of the capital. In the following months, the rest of the division continued to return to the country, and the third echelon, at the invitation of the Portuguese government, changed its route and arrived in Lisbon on September 3rd, holding a parade through the streets of the Portuguese capital. The last echelon of troops from the Brazilian Expeditionary Force arrived in Rio de Janeiro on November 3rd, 1945, closing the chapter of Brazil's participation in the greatest armed conflict in human history. Over the course of 239 uninterrupted days on the front line, a period much longer than the vast majority of American divisions, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force took part in the main battles fought by the 4th Army Corps, being entrusted with missions of the highest importance. These missions were carried out with commendable performance, praised by the entire Allied High Command. The Brazilian division captured a total of 2,573 prisoners, more than its own strength, and it liberated 100 Italian towns from German occupation. It is still recognized in Italy today for the brotherhood with which it treated Italian civilians, sharing its rations with them during the harsh months of that winter. Of the 25,334 Brazilians sent to combat, 465 lost their lives there, and thousands more were wounded. They were sent for treatment in Brazil or in the United States. The dead of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force were initially buried in the Pistoia Cemetery in Italy. But in 1960, they were transferred to Rio de Janeiro, where they now rest at the National Monument to the Dead of World War II. The legacy of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force is one of capability, adaptation, and overcoming obstacles. They proved to the rest of the world, in its most dramatic moment, the value and courage of a country called Brazil. Did you like the story? If you enjoy our work and want to support the channel, you can do so by sending us donations or by supporting us on Apoia-C. That way you join our very important person WhatsApp group and discuss upcoming topics with me. I want to thank everyone who's helping, but especially these friends here who are top-notch. For now, watch these videos I picked out for you. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any notifications. When I post more videos, I'll be signing off for now, and I thank you again for watching. Big hug from the War Room.